Ira Shapiro is one, if not the number one um, expert on the United States Senate, and has an extraordinary knowledge of the the workings of government overall. And I've been turning to him uh, on several occasions in the last few months to kind of keep our fingers on the pulse of where things are at. And so I figured we better, 4 weeks before the election, we better have a final session, and maybe even a prediction.
Well, Wayne, it's always great to see you. And, the kind of independent minded New Hampshire person that I wish characterized the whole electorate.
Yeah. Well, that's maybe we'll get back to that. I mean, one of the things that makes your knowledge base so interesting, Ira, is that you were a staffer to the last great Senate.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, I I grew up during the last constitutional crisis when Vietnam morphed into Watergate over time, and the country was being torn apart first over the war and then the abuses of Richard Nixon's presidency. And at that time, the Senate was a beacon of hope for a lot of us because it was standing up to the war, investigating the war, and ultimately played a role in investigating Nixon and led to his resignation. And I had the chance to be an intern in the Senate, and I got hooked on it. And it actually, I wouldn't have thought it would shape my life and career, but it did. And I worked there 12 years in the 70s and the 80s. And it was a time when the Senate was at the peak of its influence. Uh, Great members and people who knew how to be senators working in the national interest in a bipartisan way. And it shaped my career, but it's also shaped my perspective on how things ought to work. I wrote one book celebrating, recounting, it was not a memoir, it was the last great Senate, recounting how the Senate worked in the narrative history in the late 1970s. And I thought I was done with the subject, but when Trump became president, I used my Senate background as my lens on what was happening to the democracy. And the decline of the Senate and the deep downward spiral into partisanship and division has been a big part of the story of our politics. Obviously, when the history of the period is written, Trump will be at the center of it. His amazing tenure as president and his continuing influence. But the Senate's failure to play the role it was supposed to play has been fundamental to what's happened to our country.
And in your opinion, has the failure of the Senate uh, been more long-standing than just the Trump years?
Yes, thanks for asking, Wayne. I mean, from my standpoint, the Senate has been in decline for about at least 30 years. One could argue that the deterioration of our politics started on the House side with Newt Gingrich, but the influence of Gingrich and sort of a radicalization of the Republicans and a change in approach to politics, so that Gingrich saw politics as a form of war, and he changed the discourse and the way politics was done. And then over time, McConnell emerged as perhaps the most successful political actor of our time, most influential, but very destructive in terms of obstruction when there was a Democratic president, Obama particularly, and then kind of a partisan steamroller helping Trump do things. And what was lost was the notion of the Senate as a moderating force in the country. Walter Mondale called it the nation's mediator, the place where the hard issues got worked out by principled compromise by the parties. That was lost. And we just became one more partisan battle. I wrote the update to my book, the last book. I found that the Senate had actually functioned pretty well in 2022. Number of bipartisan accomplishments that you wouldn't have thought possible, but that was the exception to the long decline. And stand up for marriage equality, all kinds of things that were able to be done because 49 or 50 Democrats joined with 12 to 15 House Republicans. So it was how the system was supposed to work, and very rarely has.
Right. Do you, so are you working on another book now, Ira?
No, not at the moment. I've written a series of articles in the past couple of months. I try to write on things that are related to the Senate and related to the presidential race. Also, I've written about what I call the radical or extreme court, the Supreme Court. Between now and November, anything I can do to help in the elections, I try to do.
Right.
After that, I'll figure out if I've got another book to write.
Well, do you want to take a moment to talk about the Supreme Court before we get back to the Senate?
Well, I think they're closely related, of course, because the Senate's role in confirming Supreme Court justices was crucial to the creation of this radical court. Many of your listeners know or remember that in 2016, when Justice Scalia died, Mitch McConnell made the unprecedented decision that the Senate would not consider a successor to fill that vacancy because it was an election year. And he succeeded in blocking Merrick Garland from being considered. And he held the seat open, and it paid big dividends when Donald Trump was elected because it gave them the first Supreme Court justice. And then McConnell completed his work by ramming through. He put the steel in Trump's spine and kept Brett Kavanaugh when it looked like Kavanaugh was in trouble. And then 8 days before election day, he confirmed Amy Coney Barrett, creating the court's supermajority. And the court, by any historical standards, has broken with precedent in many areas. It's essentially run roughshod over constitutional rights, and the Dobbs case is best known, but it's not the only case. It's cut back on the ability of the federal government or the state governments and localities to regulate guns, even though the Heller decision in 2008 said there's a Second Amendment right to have private ownership of guns, but it can subject to be reasonable regulation. And this court has been unethical as well. But I think the thing that has poisoned it most was the corrupted confirmation process and the radicalism by the court, which is untethered by any respect for precedent.
Right. It it's a how is it that they rationalize here you have a group of people, particularly the more conservative members, who have uh, over the years insisted on this strict interpretation of the Constitution, and yet completely went off the reservation with respect to that over the last few years. How do they rationalize that, and how do you think that it came to pass?
Well, I give them credit. When I say I give them credit, I give the Republicans credit for what McConnell would call the long game. The Republicans, backed by the Federalist Society particularly, have focused on the Supreme Court and moving it far to the right since the 1980s. And what you see for many years is that they tried to do it, but most of the justices, and by the way, the Senate confirmed 10 consecutive justices for over 25 years that were nominated by Republican presidents, not one Democrat, from 1969 to 1992. But those justices, for a long time, turned out to be relatively responsible guardians of the Constitution. And they got the Republicans and the Federalists even angrier. And they kept at it. And they kept at it. And finally, they had the opportunity to put in people that were not responsible conservatives, but were extremists. Kavanaugh, Gorsuch, Amy Coney Barrett are not conservative in any sense of the word. And they've joined with three other people, Alito, Thomas, and Roberts, in a way that has been totally destructive. And their view was, essentially, they have a political and, I'm afraid, a religious agenda that has colored their decisions from the beginning. You use the word, and everyone uses the word, and I use the word in my book, conservative, liberal versus conservative. But there's nothing conservative about the members of this court. They are quite extreme.
Right. And how much of this, how does this tie into the whole controversy over Project 2025?
Well, I think the Trump campaign and even the former president himself, are trying to distance themselves from 2025. But the 2025 project, spearheaded by the Heritage Foundation and staffed and advised by many Trump advisors, is a radical blueprint for remaking our government, for reducing the influence of career civil servants, putting in all kinds of political appointees. And across the board, it would be a fundamental blueprint for changing America in ways that most people don't support. In fact, that's why the Republicans have been Trump has been trying to distance himself from 2025. But it's a pretty candid blueprint of what they want to do to the country.
And this distancing, the reality is if Donald Trump is elected president again, um, he's not going to distance himself from much of the content of uh,
Right.
2025.
Look, from my standpoint, you and I have talked about this over in the past. From my standpoint, and this comes back to the Senate, and it comes back to McConnell particularly. The Senate had a fundamental responsibility under the Constitution to be the check on a president who would abuse his powers. That was that was the concept, right? If you had a president who was overreaching, the House could impeach him, and the Senate would then have a trial and convict him. That was how you would deal with such a thing. And the Senate fundamentally failed in two impeachments, particularly the second one after January 6th, weeks after January 6th. And we are suffering from the Senate's failure since that time because the judicial process, which has struggled with the Trump cases, that was never supposed to be the way that you would check a president abusing his power. It was supposed to be the House and the Senate. The Senate failed. The judicial process struggled. And now it's really up to we the people. It's really come down to the elections around the country, and particularly the presidential election. But I found and was motivated to write my third book by the fact that the Senate had betrayed the country and had been tremendously derelict in its duties.
Right. So the title of the third book was Betrayal, correct?
Right. We went from, it wasn't planned this way, but when we went from the last great Senate to the broken Senate to the Senate that betrayed the country.
Right.
And somebody said to me, Wayne, well, that's a pretty strong word, betrayal. I said, well, if you believe that the Senate had the fundamental responsibility to act as a check on a president abusing his power, and you believe that they knew that he had abused his power, they knew it. It wasn't like they were unconscious of it. And then they failed to act on it. I'd say that was a betrayal. That's exactly what it was.
Right. And how do you explain? I mean, is it just that there's people like Ted Cruz? I mean, here's Ted Cruz who his academic career, his
Oh my God.
everything has been tied to his authority as a constitutional scholar, and yet he has completely abandoned all of those things. And to what do you attribute that?
Well, I mean, I attribute it to ambition. I attribute it to his desire to be the president of the country and be a Republican, nominee at some point. I mean, all the Republicans who have, I mean, Cruz was a hardliner to begin with, but his inability to adhere to any kind of principles, his willingness to be one of the leaders in not certifying the election in 2020, along with Josh Hawley, who's a similar case. They know where the Republican Party has gone. They know where Trump has taken it. And they're not going to be Liz Cheney. They saw what happened to Liz Cheney, who made a principled stand in favor of the Constitution and our democracy, and was basically drummed out of her party.
Right. And so uh, do you think they sat back and watched that, or do you think they actively participated in doing that to Liz Cheney?
Well, of course, Liz Cheney was in the House, so they were in the Senate, but I don't think they just sat back and watched. I think they contributed to the movement in the party for the MAGA Republican positions and the climate of, partisanship and intolerance that made it impossible for Liz Cheney. But look, you've been kind to me in citing my political background, and people sometimes ask me to make predictions. And I always say, my predictions were really good in the 20th century. But here we are, a quarter of the way through the 21st century, and my predictions may not be so reliable. Specifically on that subject, I said several years ago, Liz Cheney, she's going to be the Speaker of the House someday. Well, that was 100% wrong. You couldn't be more wrong. Instead of being the Speaker of the House, they threw her out of the House.
Yeah. But Ira, I'm not quite sure how to put this, but if all goes well from my perspective, and from your perspective too, I believe, this election will thoroughly put to rest the question of whether Donald Trump should ever serve this country again. And it will do that by electing, our first woman president. And you have to admit that there is something beautiful. If that works, there is something beautifully poetic about the fact that all of those big institutions that should have saved the country years ago in this process failed, and it comes to us to do it.
Well, the operative word, I suppose, is if.
Right.
I mean, I've been very optimistic relative to most other people in thinking this would not be as close an election as 2016 or 2020. I have felt that Kamala Harris would ride a surge of excitement, and that, powered by the votes, particularly of women and younger people who got excited about the election, that she would win decisively. Having said that, I'm not immune from all this polls and all the commentary, which suggests that it's still surprisingly, in my view, close. And it's a worrisome development to see an election that is still this close, even though I tend to believe that it'll be a turnout election and that Democrats will turn out more strongly than, they won't turn out more strongly than the Trump base. They will turn out, and the enlarged turnout will exceed the Trump base. I don't think the former president is able to enlarge his base very much.
Well, and he really made much of an effort to do so.
Well, but in your formulation, Wayne, I think that it would be a beautiful culmination if it happens that way.
Right. And I tend to agree with you that, I've been much more optimistic about the numbers. I think polling in 2024, it's very difficult. Look, Do you answer your phone when you don't
Yeah,
recognize the
exactly. I,
number?
I feel that way too. I mean, who who answers their phone for a poll, or answers their phone for any number that they're not familiar with? So, no, no, look, but today's paper reminds us of what an unusual system we have. There's an article, lead article is about the race in Pennsylvania, and it refers to, well, welcome to the United States of Pennsylvania. This is ground zero. And the amount of time Harris was there 3 times last week, Trump was there 3 times, the amount of money, 100,000 people. The Democrats turned out 100,000 people, volunteers in Pennsylvania last weekend.
Wow.
Um, well, that's amazing. And similar things are happening in 6 other states. I hope the 43 other states don't get resentful and still vote.
Yeah. And
A
as
weird system. I was glad, by the way, that Kamala Harris, came up to New Hampshire and put out features of her economic plan there. I think it'd be good to make a few trips in different parts of the country to remind people this is a national election.
right, right,
Not just the United States of Pennsylvania, Georgia, and Michigan.
yeah. Uh, the Michigan thing puzzles me. I don't think that I've ever seen Michigan as being quite so much of a a squeaker.
Well, it wasn't of the battleground states that Biden won. Michigan was the one he won largest last time.
Right.
Remember, it was 10,000 votes in Georgia or something like 11,000, but he won Michigan by 150,000. The concerns in Michigan, I think, from a Democratic standpoint, are two. One is the effect that the Israel Hamas war has had on Arab Americans, Muslim Americans, and their attitude toward the war. The population in Michigan has a significant Arab American population, Muslim American. And the second is the difficult challenges of the energy, the move to renewable energy as epitomized by electric vehicles, and how that affects auto workers. And the Republicans are running on that, saying that, the Biden's EV policy, Harris EV policy, are costing people jobs. And it's one of the most challenging things you can do. And I think Biden and Harris have done pretty well in moving us toward the energy renewal and renewable energy we need, while at the same time recognizing domestic production of energy, oil and gas, has to stay high for a while. So I think they've done a good job, but it's easy to demagogue the issues.
Right, right. It- and it doesn't help that we've had back to back hurricanes that have just
Well, look, it's remarkable to me that Trump and the Republicans have been totally opposed to measures that would mitigate and combat climate change. Trump, in his term of office, pulled us out of the Paris Climate Agreement. McConnell has always taken the lead in opposing anything, domestic or international, that would move us in the way of a climate change policy. To me, that should move I think that will move young people, but I think it should move a lot of people. But you know, who knows exactly what issues are moving? I always say to people, whatever issues move you, take a look at the difference between the parties at this point. Uh, whether it's climate change, whether it's gun violence, certainly abortion, healthcare. The Republicans will come back to try to get the Affordable Care Act again. They're kind of recidivists on that subject. So, and the future of the federal courts. You go down the list, there ought to be something there that convinces you that this is an important election.
Yeah. Do you concur with most of the people that I've listened to lately that this is probably the most important election, at least since the Civil War?
I think so. I think so. I was in a discussion yesterday about with some people who were saying, well, we've got a plan for what if Trump gets elected, what we would do, how the Asia Pacific area would look, and how China, Japan would react. I said, well, I think we've actually ought to spend the next month making sure he's not elected. I think I think if Trump is elected, knowing everything we know about him at this point, if the American people decide to give him another term of office, I believe there will be no effective guardrails. And I think I truly do think it's an existential choice.
Uh-huh. I think a lot of people hear the term guardrails, but are never quite sure what it means. How would you describe that to the average person who's listening to this and doesn't spend their time talking about all this all the time?
Well, look, I think many people know that our concept uh, constitutional system is a checks and balance system where the president has significant great power, but that is offset or supposed to be offset by the fact that Congress is the legislative branch and created under Article 1, does the legislating and also does the oversight, should be able to balance the president and check him in various ways. That's historically how it's worked. And the court system is supposed to be a check on executive power and congressional overreach. But what happened? We've had a weakened Congress because of the partisan divide and the increasing radicalism of the Republicans over time. So they didn't act as an effective check on Trump through impeachment and conviction. And we have a court system that is populated by a lot of right-wing judges who were appointed in the Trump years, and the supermajority of extreme justices. So those are the guardrails. The first two guardrails would be Congress and the courts, and they've been weakened. And the other guardrail is civil service, the people who are day-to-day civil servants, and that Trump and Project 2025 want to disempower. So you look at it, and all of a sudden, you don't have a lot of guardrails there.
Right.
The last guardrail, of course, that's most important in our system is the press. And we could go on at great length about how that works and doesn't work at this point.
All of those things kind of come together a bit with uh, with an interview that I saw with J.D. Vance recently um, where he suggested just uh, firing most of the civil servants, and then when the court inevitably says you can't do that, you tell the court that they would have to figure out a way to enforce that. I mean, it was his words were
Yeah,
exactly the words that Jackson used when he forced the Indian Removal Act on the country, despite the Marshall Court's ruling that it was unconstitutional.
yeah. Well, you got a great historical recollection there. I mean, they have the Republicans and Trump, Vance, and the MAGA Republicans have sort of a multi-level approach to it. The first thing is you do your best to stack the courts with judges that will agree with you. But if you happen to hit a judge that doesn't agree with you, you just disregard him, or you get it up to the Supreme Court and try to get it overruled. I think that's what I mean in part by why the guardrails are not very good. And it's up to we, the people, to prevent Donald Trump and J.D. Vance from taking office.
But even if all goes well with the election from my perspective, um,
Our perspective.
our perspective, uh, we're we are going to be faced with uh, many years, I'm afraid, of fighting this battle over the philosophy that governs Project 2025. I mean, it's really President Obama in his speech at the convention sort of alluded to the fact that, you know, are we losing pluralism, in this country, which is what we have that allows us to uh, to communicate with one another and to agree and disagree and work out things.
No, there's no question that we've lost a lot of that. And to some extent, as you know, as your listeners know, to some extent, this is a debate and a problem going on all over the world. I mean, virtually every advanced democracy has had this sort of battle between, kind of the side that supports the principles of liberal democracy and pluralism, as opposed to the other side, which is sort of the illiberal side, which tends to believe that in a complex world, the answer is to basically shut the door on the others and also to essentially, you need a strong leader. Democracy isn't the idea. What you need is you need a Putin, you need an Orban, you need, and you go down the list. And worldwide, the illiberal forces are doing pretty well. And Robert Kagan, the historian, has written a book about the fact that illiberalism is a big strand in American history, sort of an ongoing contest. You referred to Jackson. That's one example. In the 30s, we had Father Coughlin and Charles Lindbergh, and a very strong support for, something that looked like fascism at the time.
Right.
And that was ultimately vanquished. But these things recur in the United States. So yes, it'll be a long struggle.
I, I
A
suppose
continuing struggle.
at least in our modern history, it is an ongoing fight. And there's, I recently, I haven't finished it, but I've been working on a column that's titled "Pluralism or Pitcairn," because I tried to find an island where all of those 2025ers could go to live so that they could have their own world and leave it alone. And there wasn't anything left with the possible exception of the Pitcairn Islands, which is so poetic when you think of Mutiny on the Bounty.
That's funny. That's funny. No, it's the only thing I've been struck by the fact that the last 8 or 9 years since the rise of Trump and the COVID period, the only really good thing I can say about it is that it's been interesting, really interesting period to live through.
It's the old Chinese curse, right, Ira?
Yeah,
May
we've
you live
overdone
in
it this time,
yeah.
Wayne. We have lived in interesting times.
Yep, that's for sure. So will the betrayal stand?
I think it all depends on the election. I mean, if somebody asked me recently, who'd be the next Republican leader since McConnell is no longer going to be the leader, I said it all depends on the election. If Trump is defeated, then the sort of more traditionally conservative types like John Thune or John Cornyn will have a chance to become Republican leader. I think if Trump was elected, he's not going to put up with that kind of a leader in the Senate. So he might look at one of the MAGA Republicans. I certainly think, having watched the debate, as I'm sure you did, between Vance and Walz, I certainly think we have not seen the end of J.D. Vance, even if Trump is defeated this time. I think he has shown sufficient political talent, including his shape shifting and his ability to, reinvent himself. I think we'll be seeing him for quite a while.
Yeah, I'm afraid you're
If
right.
Trump loses, he's a likely inheritor, even
Right.
if Trump loses.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you're not going to give me a prediction, huh, Ira?
Oh, my prediction is Kamala will win. But but my hope has been that we needed a decisive enough victory so that 2 or 3 days after Election Day, McConnell and Lindsey Graham and the other quote unquote traditional Republicans would acknowledge her as president elect in a way that they didn't do with Joe Biden in 2020.
Right.
If you go back, and I've got a chapter on this on my book, but if you go back to 2020, the big lie that the election was stolen and rigged, it blazed through the country in the 5 weeks after the election and before the Electoral College vote. Those 5 weeks are when, by polls, 70% of Trump's voters thought the election was stolen. 50 million people thought the election was stolen. That small group of people that showed up on January 6th to rally and then storm the Capitol were motivated by the big lie. And why did the big lie take hold? It took hold because the more respectable Republicans didn't contradict Trump.
Right.
And I hold that against McConnell and the others. We need a result that doesn't produce a similar 5 or 6 or 8 week period of lies and chaos.
Right, and they can't change their minds. I mean, there was immediately following the events of January 6th, there were people, including McConnell, who condemned what happened, but then they went silent.
No, that's absolutely right. You can't give a better speech about January 6th than McConnell gave in condemning Trump. He gave an eloquent speech about how the president was morally responsible for what had happened. And he gave another great speech right when they voted on the second impeachment, except he then concluded, well, he's the former president, so we can't possibly convict him. I think McConnell has always believed that Trump would wither away. We need to test Trump, but he didn't think he was strong enough to take him down, and so he didn't. And Trump hasn't withered away because they didn't take him down.
Right. And he wasn't strong enough to take him down. I mean,
well, he would have been strong enough to take him down
if he had stood up. Right. Right.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it is said, well, we wouldn't have had the votes to convict him. That's nonsense. If McConnell had been for convicting him, they would have had the votes to convict him.
Right. Well, Ira Shapiro, you always have gems for us, and I'm optimistic about the election, and for the first time in quite a while, I've been saying that I have faith ultimately in the people of this country.
Well, I'm with you on that, but we ought to get back together again a couple of months down the line and assess whether we were right.
Let's do that, my friend.
I'd love to do that.
I will make sure that in the show notes we have all your books. And Ira, it's so great to talk with you always, and thank you very much for not only giving us your time, but putting up with a few of the technical snafus that we have had.
Been my pleasure, Wayne. Always great to see you.
Good to see you, my friend. Take care.
Take care.
This song is dedicated to the people of the world and all its inhabitants. We've got to learn to live together with some understanding and care for each other. Let's go the extra mile and do it with a smile. Said if it's true, tell me why we cannot try. Tell me why